Hi, this is Andrea, and we're back again talking about The Language of Medicine, 12th edition by Davy Ellen Chabner. This is for HSC 114, and we are on to chapter 3. So now we're on to suffixes. What are our goals? To define the new suffixes and review those that have been presented in the previous chapters. We need to gain practice in word analysis by using these suffixes with combining forms to build and understand terms, and identify the functions of the different types of the blood cells in the body. And we will talk more about blood cells later because we actually talk on the body system of that, but we will briefly touch on it here. So let's get started. Here are some combining forms. Oh my, lots of them, all with their meanings. Those are all that we need to know. All ones we need to know, definitely. And you'll see more. And still more. And more and more and more. And another page of them. One of the ones you don't see on here, PHAG means to eat or swallow. PHAS has to do with speech. And sometimes those two get mixed up. Phagia is to eat or swallow. Phasia is to speak. And you think about stroke patients. Sometimes they have dysphagia afterwards or dysphagia. Those two sound so similar, but the difference is one is to eat and swallow, the other one is the ability to speak. So be watching out for that as you go through there. And keep coming on down, lots to learn. And interestingly enough, you think about Staphylococcus, that type of bacteria, clusters. Staphylo means clusters. And strepto means twisted chains. Has anyone ever had strep throat? You have twisted chains, those bacteria are twisted chains, and that's part of what that strep means. And then we get into all sorts of suffixes. And you'll notice we talked about Staphylococcus or Streptococcus. It's a berry-shaped bacterium, the coccuses. And if it's plural, it's cocci. Okay? And watch that with the double C's. That can sometimes get a bit challenging. And here are more suffixes. And you have still more. And more. Only up to the letter P, I'm afraid, in the alphabet. And S usually has quite a few. Notice the difference between scope and scopy. Scope is an instrument. Scopy is visual examination. So scope, if you're talking about a laparoscope, endoscope, those are the instruments that are used for visual examination. Scopy is the process. You're using the scope, but it's the process of actually doing the visual examination. So you might want to pay attention to that. Another one is RIA. RIA, you've got to remember those two R's and that H. That seems to be an odd combination, and it is, but make sure 2 R's and an H when you're going to use that for meaning flow or discharge. And ptosis is another one that kind of stumbles people because of the P before the T. You don't pronounce it, it's ptosis, but that P is there, so make sure you're aware of that. Another one that sometimes people trip over is stomy versus tomy. A stomy is an opening, like a stoma. A tomy is where you're cutting into something, you're incising into it. And unfortunately, trophy is not the same type of a trophy as you would expect to when you win a competition. Trophy has to do with development or nourishment. And most often you hear of dystrophy, like muscular dystrophy. So, fear of heights, pop quiz. And I'll let you look through your book to find the answer. Here are more suffixes, and these are little ones, short ones. Watch out for ol and eul. They mean the same thing, but when you're spelling, you need to know which one you're using, which one is correct. And the same thing with and eum. Again, ac and IAC, ac and IAC, those are the same, pertaining to, but in order to spell it correctly, you need to know which one belongs with which one. So be watching for that as you're learning and going through the book and assimilating that. And then you have all of these that mean pertaining to, which can get really crazy, huh? AL, AR, EAL, and sometimes genic. Sometimes genic really is more producing or produced by. So I wouldn't really necessarily include that with pertaining to, but it can sometimes be. Mostly try and keep that production thought with you. Then ick and ickel are again pertaining to, but when do you use ick versus when do you use ickel? That will be something that you'll be learning. O's and us. OSE versus OUS, very different spellings, but if they're both being used for pertaining to, you need to know which one is the right. Like adipose tissue would be an example of using O's. So here are some really good ones for us to start with. Arthur, which is joint. Think Arthur is joint. Itis, inflammation. So you have inflammation of the joint. Blepharoptosis. Blepharoptosis. It's a drooping eyelid. Ptosis, remember that's the eye. Ptosis is, I'm sorry, the drooping. Ptosis is the drooping, and blepharo is the eyelid. So make sure you understand that. Ischemia. Ischemia. And that's loss of normal blood flow. Osteogenic. Osteogenic. It's something that's produced by the bone. Staphylococci. And those are those berry clustered bacteria that grow in clusters. Staphylococci. Okay, so let's take a look at what a hernia is. I mentioned those earlier. Sometimes you get what is called an inguinal hernia or an umbilical hernia. And a hernia is a protrusion of an organ or the muscular wall of an organ through the cavity that normally contains it. And there's different reasons why you can get a hernia. This just gives you an example of two types of female reproductive system hernias that occur in those, a cystocele and a rectocele. And so it's going to ask you, what is it? Now, Streptococcus and Staphylococcus, bacteria that grow in chains or clusters. Now they're going to ask you about blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, or clotting cells. Erythrocytes. Erythrocytes. Cyte is the cell. Erythro is red. Luke is again red. It's white. Sorry, leuco is white, and cytes again is cell. Cytes down here, cell. Thrombo means like thrombosis, means clot or clotting. So if you hear of thrombocytes, those are the clotting cells. They're also known as platelets. And this goes into more detail about erythrocytes. And it gives you the word hemoglobin. We looked at globin earlier, and I joked with you that we probably should think of that as a glob of protein made up of blood. It's blood protein. Leukocytes are white blood cells. They fall into two categories, granulocytes and mononuclear leukocytes. And if you need to read or research more about that, you can Google it or check your book. And the granulocytes are three that you may have heard of: eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. And then the mononuclear cells are lymphocytes or monocytes. And again, I'm going to refer you to your book to take a look at those a little bit further. And this is a visual breakdown of what we've just been talking about with white blood cells. So then we talk about platelets briefly, and those are in the bone. Those are formed in your bone marrow, in your bones. And this is a nice visual. It gives you kind of a difference between, okay, there's your red blood cells at the top, then the different types of white blood cells in the middle, and your little thrombocytes or those platelets at the bottom. And they ask you which are necessary for clotting. I know you can get this one. We just studied it. Now they're going to look at a condition called acromegaly. Acromegaly, and that's an endocrine disorder. We'll probably cover that in more detail when we get to, is it chapter 18, I believe, is endocrine. Let me look. Yes, starting on page 699, and that just talks about what they do and how they identify. Oh, sorry, I went too fast. This talks about how it usually has something to do with the pituitary gland and how that affects the features. The next one is laparoscopy. Laparoscopy. It's a form of minimally invasive surgery. You'll hear it called a lap most often in the hospital, but it's a laparoscopy or a laparotomy, that type of thing. So this gives you the information about that. Adenoids. Have you ever heard of tonsils? Somebody who had their tonsils and adenoids out. This explains what the difference is with adenoids. All right, that is it for chapter 3. So I will be back soon to talk to you about chapter 4. Keep studying.